Newsline Live. Now then, as the government today announced, the Minister of Finance has announced that EPF, ETF funds will not be subject to the proposed 25% surcharge tax. We nevertheless thought we'd continue coverage on this very important topic because, of course, it affects corporate Sri Lanka, and the private sector is, after all, acknowledged to be the growth, the engine of growth for our economy. In that respect, we have a former chairperson of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce with us this evening, and well-respected gentleman in the commercial world. He's right here in the studio with us, Mr. Suresh Shah. Very good evening to you, Mr.
Good evening,
Suresh.
Faraz.
Now then, these taxes, they're described as one-off, but there was a one-off before, and probably there will be more one-offs. So they're sort of irregular but regular taxes. How does this impact the private sector growth, you know? How does it impact?
So I think first let's also understand that as a country we need to increase government revenue, state revenue. Just to give you some numbers, if you look at the revenue last year, it was about 9.5% of GDP, and I think we need to, over a period of time, take that up to about 15%. So there is, or maybe even a little more than that. So there is no question that the government's revenue base is low, and that we need to take we need to increase that revenue base. But we need to do it on a consistent basis rather than do it for 1 year. So the important thing is we need to find methods of taxation that will help us generate revenue on a sustainable basis. This particular tax, on the other hand, like you said, is supposed to be a one-off tax, and so whilst it may raise revenue in this year, extent of revenue in this year, whether it will do so on a consistent basis is a question mark. But having said that, like you pointed out, in 2015 there was a similar tax, and if you don't have the if you don't have the right taxation system in the country, and if you don't do the necessary tax reforms, the chances are that, like you rightly said, a few years down the road you may have these one-off taxes all over again. Now the challenge here is that when taxes are unexpected and of such a significant amount, the lowest impact would be around 500 million, it creates a shock. And that's not good. Businesses don't like shocks. Businesses like to plan ahead. They like predictability. They like consistency. So taxes of this nature, unfortunately, takes away the consistency, takes away the ability to plan. It puts businesses on the back foot. And so to that extent, whilst yes, there is a requirement for revenue, the method adopted, there were other options.
And we will come to the international aspect a little bit, but maybe looking at the local aspect. The unfairness is probably glaring to average citizen Sri Lanka, because you have these are sort of they're shocks to the system. But what does this do to the growth of these companies, the employment opportunities they create, internal promotions and all sorts of things, when the money supply is suddenly taken away? That would be one question. The other question would be, once the profits are distributed, some of it retained, and plans made for investment and furtherance of the business, and once it's all in place, how do you then find 500 million rupees to pay the government?
So, I mean, it's a regulation, it's a law, and companies will have to comply. So they will figure out a way to make the payments. But it's the impact of that can be of concern. And I think the biggest impact would be that companies may end up having to relook at their investment options available. So they may delay investment. And Sri Lanka right now, we need investment into the economy, and because investment generates jobs, investment brings in tax revenues, and so on and so forth. So Sri Lanka is a country that requires investment, and we should be doing things that actually promote investment. And unfortunately, like I said, when you have shocks of this nature, that puts it on a back foot. So my real concern where taxes of this nature are concerned is that it has an impact on investment. There are, like you rightly said, there will be other impacts as well. Companies may scale back on increments that they might give their employees in the coming year. Dividends could get affected. So like this, we will see a ripple effect. But I think the real challenge is going to be that these are the big companies, right? And they are the companies that can make the big investments.
Yeah.
And they may end up scaling some of those back.
And how difficult is it to restart once that happens? Like, if you remember in 2015, the government of the day, they put on hold various projects which they wanted to look closer at the contracts. And then you saw that the whole economy sort of contracted, and there were problems. Is that significant? Can that happen in terms of this surcharge tax?
Yeah, sure. Because particularly because we are in a difficult situation at the moment. I mean, partly to do with the pandemic, partly to do with the forex crisis. So we are not in a buoyant economy at the moment. Had we been in a buoyant economy, I think the impact of this particular tax, the impact of the tax on investment may have been somewhat less. But because of the other externalities as well, I think the impact this time is probably going to be greater in terms of what it might do on the investment front. So
things are only going to get worse? I thought we were at the bottom of the pile anyway, and it can only get better.
Hopefully it can. Hopefully it can get only better. But I mean, you never know. If the country is going through a crisis that we all know. We feel it now. And one doesn't know, there is a war that might happen in Ukraine. I don't know what the impact of that might be. The Fed is talking about raising interest rates very soon within the US. I don't know what that impact will have on Sri Lanka. Omicron is still with us. So there are a lot of externalities that are working against Sri Lanka at the moment. And so one doesn't know,
As a sort of a seasoned member of this commercial world here in Sri Lanka, what would you advise? If you were to be asked to give an advisory to the government, what would you ask them to do?
Like I said earlier, the country does need additional revenue when it comes to, it needs additional revenue. And so we need to find sustainable ways of getting that revenue. We need to aim for around 15–16% of GDP as our revenue. And there are methods that can be adopted to do that. Where this particular tax itself is concerned, I know that the Ceylon Chamber has made some recommendations. One recommendation was that, rather than target 62 companies or 65 companies or whatever it might be, to have a 10% tax surcharge across all taxable, everyone's taxable income. That would have been more equitable to start with. If 10% was seen as too high a number for those with lower levels of income, maybe have a staggered tax rate, so starting with something as low as 5% and taking it up to maybe 12%. So that would have been an option. I think there is an option when it comes to VAT. Some time back we reduced the rate from 15 to 8. The intention there was, I think, good in the sense that it was expected that it will make the economy grow more buoyant and so on and so forth, but the pandemic didn't happen. But is there an opportunity actually to take that 8% up to maybe 10% in phase 1 and then beyond? Maybe up, in a second year up to maybe 12. So that's another option available. A third option available might be the tax rates themselves. I think individuals, for example, are on 18% rate. That's a pretty good rate. I mean, it's a pretty low rate if you look across the region. And is there some potential to maybe make a slight adjustment there? Going back to VAT, we have, if you remember, the threshold was reduced from 300 million, from 12 million, it was increased to 300 million. Is there some space there to make some adjustment? So these are all options available in terms of raising revenue in a much more sustainable way, rather than looking at these one-off taxes.
I see. And so the only thing that the people who are sovereign can do, of course, is to go to the Supreme Court and say that these are unfair practices. But you know, how many of these big corporates are going to actually take on the government of the day?
That's not something that the corporates would do. I can't see that happening. Governments are very powerful for us, and government and the Sri Lankan government, with its ability to bring out gazettes whenever they want, governments are very powerful. So I don't think the private sector would take that step of going to the Supreme Court. Plus, also, I think when you look at it from a government's point of view, they have the right to tax.
Of course, they have.
Yeah.
But any tax must be, there must be a rationality there, apart from equity and so on. And if there is discrimination, it should be intelligibly explained or explainable. And in the lack of all that, it is entirely possible that the Supreme Court may well find a few more cases coming its way. It's not like they don't have enough to do anyway. But what can you do? But the wider picture is that, when companies are forced into a tight space, the opportunities will be curtailed, and the sort of knock-on effect will be limited employment opportunities, and with that the quality of life and all that in the wider Sri Lanka will nevertheless be affected. What about charities and so on? What can they too may find themselves at the receiving end of getting little money rather than the amounts of getting.
You're right. I mean, all these are possible, but I think the real impact, in addition to the Sri Lankan companies investing or scaling back on their investments, the bigger impact, I think, for the country is that we will there'll be a question mark over FDI. Unlike a Sri Lankan company, foreign investors have many opportunities across the world, right? So they would look at different countries, different environments, and they would take all these into account, and they will look at environments which are more predictable, with more consistent policies, and they would ask themselves the question, why invest in a country with a level of unpredictability, inconsistency, and so on and so forth. So I think the bigger impact is going to come from a lack or a drop in FDI. Sri Lanka needs FDI at this moment in time, particularly because we have this forex crisis. But even more than that, for technology transfer, for bringing in new and better management practices, for R&D to get us export markets, and so on and so forth. So Sri Lanka is a country that needs FDI. And unfortunately, these kinds of ad hoc one-off taxes can have an impact on FDI, and I think that's going to be the biggest impact for Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much for your questions, ladies and gentlemen out there. It's 0772 300 305 by SMS and or WhatsApp, please. It says here, raising revenue and taxation is one way, but another one that is hardly ever spoken about is, of course, the expenditure due to corruption and fancy projects and so on and so forth, which we are reminded from time to time is actually massive. If you were to do a course correction, and as a member of the corporate world, what would you like to see happen there?
So if you look at Sri Lanka's expenditure overall in total, it's as a percentage of GDP, which is around 22 thereabouts. We are kind of on par with our comparator countries. The challenge, though, is the quality of the expenditure. So for example, Are we spending too little on, say, health, on education, on infrastructure? Are we spending too much on the public sector, for example? Is too much money going on loss-making SOEs? Is our defense budget too high? So it's the quality of the expenditure that we need to really focus on, and whilst the overall number may be, you know, benchmark ballpark with our comparator countries, can we shift them from, say, particular types of expenditure to more productive expenditure, like, you know, education, healthcare, infrastructure, stuff like that?
And on that note, let's go for a quick peek at this evening's headlines from that wonderful News First Primetime News team. We'll see you on the other side of the break, shall we?
News First, Newsline with Faraz, Shauketaly.
Valuable Finance, best finance company.
රැස්විහිදෙන ජීවිතේ.
PUCSL solution to avoid power cuts. Activist Shehan Malika granted bail. Cardinal dismayed over April 21st attack investigations.
අපි නීතිපතිතුමාගෙන් බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන්නේ මෙවැනි ක්‍රියාකලාපයක් නොවේ. ඔහු මහජන සේවකයෙක් විනා දේශපාලකයන්ගේ අතකොළුවක් නොවේ කියා මතක් කරන්න කැමැතියි.
Minister vows to stand with journalists. Ministers welcome fuel on credit. Will the surcharge tax bill be reversed? Healthcare workers call off strike temporarily.
ජනාධිපතිවරයාගේ විශේෂ මැදිහත් වීමක් මේකට අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා.
TV1 රැස්විහිදෙන ජීවිතේ.
News First, Newsline with Faraz, Shauketaly.
And welcome back to Newsline Live. I'm in conversation with Mr. Suresh Shah, who's a former chairperson at the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Now then, I'd like our viewers, actually, if you would like to, you can send me an SMS, not now, or you can just do it in your own time. And if you think that what you think of the proposed surcharge tax, we have one component or one side of people who tell us that because a small group of companies are the targets or the victims, if you like, of the 2 billion and the surcharge tax, that in itself is apparently glaringly at odds when tested against the Constitution of Sri Lanka. And that is, the Constitution of Sri Lanka envisages a situation of equality for all before the law, and that includes companies registered in Sri Lanka too. So what do you think? Do send us an SMS and or a WhatsApp to 0772 300 305. And let's continue with our guest this evening, Mr. Suresh Shah. Mr. Shah, so the real problem will actually happen where we can't see it, because it will be investors looking at bringing money into Sri Lanka, taking whatever opportunities there may be, and also at any time when following the war or following bad times, there are plenty of venture capitalists and so on who will look at those opportunities. But when they do that, they'll find that Sri Lanka thinks that $10 million is a lot of money, and we have a government who appear to have run out of plans, and certainly no commitment on long-term plans and stability of policy and so on. How bad will that problem really be?
Yeah, so like we were discussing earlier, the real challenge is going to be on the FDI side. And particularly for us, because this is not the first time. I mean, this happened in 2015.
Yes.
It happened under a different regime. A different political party was in power.
Yeah, so different ideology.
Different ideology, yeah, exactly. And so now the party that was in opposition at the time has come in, and now they've done exactly the same thing. So somebody from outside looking in is probably going to think that the Sri Lankan polity is such that they don't mind taxing these very successful companies in excess. And so it's really this FDI that I believe is going to be the one that's going to suffer most as a result of this. Now, also when you look at this tax, there are some anomalies as well in this sense. See, on the one hand, we offer a tax amnesty to, for people who've not paid taxes on their income, and we tell them, look, declare that income, bring that income in, and we don't charge you taxes. But on the other hand, now you have these companies that have worked very hard, they've become very successful, they've made money, and
they've taken risks along the way.
And they've taken risks along the way, yes, and then you're taxing them, right? So that's one anomaly I see. And another that I see is also that there are tax incentives given for investment on the one hand, and here you're through taxes of this one, this surcharge tax, you're actually disincentivizing investment on the other hand. So there are some contradictions as well as a result of this.
And that is actually a very valid point. When we consider that people, that the government now wants companies, and if there are any individuals earning over 2 billion rupees in that particular tax year, to pay 25%. That is, of course, having also paid the standard corporate tax of 24%. So in a way, it's like 49%. Then you compare that with what we've seen in the past. There have been exposés like the Pandora Papers and so on and so forth, this leak, that leak, and all the leaks going. And this is to do, of course, for Sri Lankans, it is the money held in overseas territories, money that is out of reach of the Sri Lankan authorities, and lo and behold, the Sri Lankan authorities say, you can bring that money back, and guess what? We don't want 25%, we don't even want 24%. We only want 1%. That's right, isn't it? 1%. How does that go down well with corporate Lanka? And you're sitting there and saying, hang on, what do you mean?
Yes, I mean, so not equitable. That's the whole point. Again, you have these companies that have worked very hard for success. They've done well, and so you tax them. But then at the same time, there are these companies, people, call it whatever, who've got undeclared income, and we are saying convert them, and there won't be a tax on that. So yes, it's not a very equitable system.
As a associated with the chambers and so on, do you think, or what's the worry out there amongst the membership that we may, for example, lose GSP Plus? Will that be another blow?
It will be a blow for Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka needs export income. GSP Plus helps in that, in getting us export proceeds. And I don't think Sri Lanka at this moment in time can afford to lose GSP Plus. Like we were discussing earlier, we are in the midst of a currency crisis, a forex crisis, and we desperately need all the export revenue that we can get. So I certainly hope we don't lose GSP Plus.
It'll only add to the troubles.
It will, yeah, for sure.
And what about how bad is the effect of COVID-19? I know that if you just observe in Sri Lanka now, life appears to be going on. and so on. There's a limited amount of tourists of whatever class they are, but there are. The fact is that there are. So how bad has this effect of COVID-19 been on businesses?
On businesses and on the country in general, yes, it has had a pretty negative impact. Lockdowns impacted quite badly. Like you rightly said, tourism has suffered a lot. So I think overall, yes, for certain, COVID has impacted. But then at the same time, now it's 2 years down the road, we need, all of us, we need to learn to live with this kind of scenario. And we need to plan taking into account, you know, issues of this nature. I must also say that notwithstanding COVID, as you can see some of the results that are coming through, companies have done well as well, particularly the bigger companies. What you probably don't see is that are the results of the smaller and the non-listed companies. And how well they are doing is difficult to judge at this moment in time. But I guess, yeah, I guess you can say that COVID has had a pretty bad impact across the board. I mean, it's disrupted everyone's lives, leave alone, I mean, forget the corporate profits, but it's disrupted people's lives.
Indeed. As somebody who's from the corporate world and so on, would you much prefer that Sri Lanka has certain national policies which are inbuilt into the constitution of Sri Lanka?
That's a difficult question to answer, Faraz, because, you know, you've got to look at this from the perspective of politics and the political economy. If you were to build certain policies into the constitution, you're going to tie the hands of the political parties and then the way the people vote for them. So you've got to allow the political parties to have their policies, as long as, you know, but at the end of the day, you hope that those policies are good for the country and that the country can develop and move forward, and that, you know, at the end of the day, that the people benefit.
Thank you very much for your questions. I'll take this one. This is from somewhere in Sri Lanka's hinterland, but I'm told that it's one of the most one of the places most likely to find millionaire taxpayers. So good for you people out there. Anyway, the question is, how much of Sri Lanka's current economic predicament is attributable to mass corruption in the conduct of government?
Corruption does play a part, but I think the more fundamental issues as to why we are where we are is because Sri Lanka for many years, in fact for decades, have run chronic twin deficits on the fiscal side. So our expenditure has been more than our revenue, as a result of which we've borrowed, and also our dollar outflows have been much more than our dollar inflows. And again, we have, as a result, we have borrowed, and this has gone on year after year after year, so our borrowings have increased. And so now we've come to a position where the borrowings that we have can't be repaid. So we have a solvency crisis at the moment. So those two chronic twin deficits are the real reason why we are here. And of course, corruption does play a part, but those two would be the bigger impact.
Would you be for a scenario where there's a zero tolerance of corruption?
Ideally, yes. I mean, I think everybody would want that.
Is that too utopian?
Let me put it this way. I mean, I can't think of a country across the world that is completely free of corruption. I think it's in degrees. So I don't know whether you can completely eliminate it, although all of us would prefer that. But I guess experience across the world would suggest that it's unlikely that you can eliminate corruption 100%.
But it'd be nice to have it.
It'll be wonderful to. Yeah.
Well, Suresh Shah, thank you very much for being on Newsline Live. And we can, after all, nothing wrong to live in hope.
In hope. Yeah.
And there's nothing quite like living in hope, especially in challenging times. But you know what? It's not all doom and gloom, because after all, we live in a part of the world that so many people would love to come and visit and create memories for themselves out here on our beautiful Sri Lanka. On that note, take care and good night. God bless you.